Google DC streetcar, and this is what you'll find. A tram in the northeast quadrant of the city. This streetcar is not very new.
It's also not very long. The DC streetcar opened in 2016 and is currently about 2 miles long.
But it's not the first streetcar DC ever had. Once, there was a trolley network 100 times larger than the current streetcar. Trolleys were the way people moved in and around the city. To work, to school, to the beach, and to the amusement park. Until the century of streetcars screeched to a halt in 1962 and the whole system was ripped up. That was 60 years ago. Surely all that's left of this old transit system is locked away in a museum, right? Wrong, actually. Neighborhoods across the city hide relics of the old trolleys, often in plain sight. Streets, apartment buildings, forests, you'll never know what history you'll find. This is where I come in. I'm Tom, and I've spent the last 6 months taking bus, train, and bike around the district, documenting as many of these streetcar remnants as I could. My collection may not be exhaustive, some things might stay secret forever, but if you're in town and you want a history tour that's off the beaten path, this is your guide. Welcome to a history of streetcars in DC. So we are going to be traveling all across the city for this video, visiting historic streetcar artifacts that are integrated into the urban fabric, not just in a museum. Except for the streetcars themselves. To see those, and to learn more about the rich history of trolleys in the capital, we will be visiting 2 museums. And the first is the Smithsonian, right on the National Mall. By the way, if you come to the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, you can find one of the old Capital Traction cars. I'll talk more about the Capital Traction Company and who they were in a little bit, but this car, number 303, was built in 1888 and retired in 1913. It is made of wood and painted yellow because back in the early days of streetcar operations, the colors of the vehicles indicated what line they ran on. The Smithsonian has another one of these cars in a storage warehouse. But to see a collection of DC streetcars from many different eras, as well as trams from other countries, you'll have to make the trek up to the National Capital Trolley Museum in Silver Spring, Maryland.
You know, I think that there is a wonderful irony to the fact that the Trolley Museum is located in a place that really reminds you just how much better our cities would be if we still had these streetcar networks instead of all this car infrastructure.
The Trolley Museum is open on Saturdays, but for this video, my friend Josh invited me to come tour the place on a weekday afternoon. Josh is one of the amazing volunteers at the Trolley Museum, and I'm very grateful for his time. The museum is always looking for more volunteers, so if you're in the area and looking to help out, definitely reach out. Otherwise, it's still just a worthwhile stop on your visit to the Washington, D.C. area. The museum is a treasure trove of history. Not only do they have a large fleet of old vehicles, their archive department is dedicated to the preservation and documentation of as many old DC streetcar artifacts as they can find.
Trolley. So lead you in. Welcome to Streetcar Hall.
Whoa. You guys have so much.
Yeah, and this is only half of our collection here. The other half is just next door in our maintenance barn.
They have vehicles here from all over the world, like this boat train from Blackpool, England, the only one in the world not in the UK or in San Francisco, but also vehicles from Dusseldorf, Berlin, Brussels, Toronto, Philadelphia, and The Hague in the Netherlands. I got the opportunity to ride the Dutch car, and to see that video, click on the link above. But we're here to learn about Washington, D.C., and they do have quite a few D.C. cars in their collection, such as this one, number 522, dating back to 1898. But then there's also this working snowplow from 1898, but I'll talk more about that in just a little bit. (1789). The United States Constitution has just been ratified. In the supreme law of the land, a small clause calls for the creation of a federal district to serve as the nation's capital. 1790. Congress authorizes George Washington to pick a spot on the Potomac River. After he did so, Pierre L'Enfant got to work designing a revolutionary street plan. At the center of the new city, the United States Capitol. In 1800, Congress meets in the unfinished building. And bringing people to the Capitol, we find the first horse-drawn stagecoaches. That's right, public transportation in DC is as old as the city itself. But a 12-seat horse-drawn carriage with a fare box wasn't the ideal form of transit along streets that were, shall we say, not paved. Other cities began building streetcars, still pulled by horses, but running on rails that were embedded in the street. However, in Washington, decisions had to be approved by Congress. This is a common theme you'll notice throughout the video. And finally, after years of lobbying, they approved the construction of a streetcar. And this happened in the middle of the Civil War. By July 1862, the Washington and Georgetown Railroad opened, kicking off a century of streetcars in Washington, D.C. The massive popularity of the first line inspired others to build their own. In the next decade, 4 more companies were chartered: the Metropolitan Railroad, Columbia Railway, Anacostia and Potomac River Railroad, and the Capitol, North O Street, and South Washington Railway. By the late 1880s, there weren't many places you could go without seeing horses pulling wooden cars filled with passengers through the ever-growing city. To get a sense of how these streetcars dominated the city streets and the legacy they've left behind, let's go to Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast. Crossing diagonally through the Capitol Hill neighborhood, this street has wide green medians. Though the tracks are long gone, the space they once took up still shapes the streets we take for granted today. Operating a streetcar required a lot of horses. These horses were put up in barns, which began to be known as car barns, because they also started housing the cars that the horses pulled. More than any other streetcar remnant, Washington, D.C. has a lot of these grand buildings, still scattered throughout the city. For example, if you ride the Metro Orange line from Minnesota Avenue Station to Stadium Armory, and you look out the right window, you'll see the red brick remains of the old Benning Road car barn. Chances are you've passed by one of these car barns without ever realizing. Now come with me to the U Street station on the Metro Green Line, and then we'll walk just a few blocks to this building. It was built by the Washington and Georgetown in 1877.
As far as I can tell, there's no signs or anything here at the Florida Avenue Car Barn that points to the building's history. I mean, you can tell definitely by the shape. It looks like a lot of the other car barns in the city.
And in more recent history, this building has served as a charter school from 1999 to 2014, and now it hosts a coffee place and a restaurant. Looks like they accidentally left their dumpsters out on the street. Now travel with me to Navy Yard, where in 1893 this castle-looking building first opened its doors, also serving the Washington and Georgetown. You'll notice that many of the car barns I show you today have arched windows. It's kind of a defining feature. Nevertheless, I struggled a little bit to find this car barn.
This is the Navy Yard Car Barn, and I had a little bit of trouble finding it because most of the pictures of it online, the building is blue.
There is some evidence left of the blue paint that was removed, but now if you want to find the Navy Yard Car Barn, you're definitely looking for a red brick building. While no longer in service as a car barn, the current owners do not let the legacy of the building fade into oblivion. Known as the Capitol Turnaround, the interior has been converted into an event space that seats 850 people. It is owned by National Community Church, and when I first read that it was a church event space, it brought me back to my good old youth group days of eating pizza and watching VeggieTales. But the Capitol Turnaround hosts a wide range of performances, from concerts to stand-up comedy. Seeing a show in an old car barn is cool, but what if you could live in one? Well, turns out you can. Now we are in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, and this is the car barn at Capitol Hill. Just 14 blocks east of the Capitol building, this condo complex is perfect for the history-loving, transit-savvy buyer looking for a one-bedroom with $415,000 burning a hole in their pocket. How'd I do? Did I get my real estate license yet?
This is so cool. It's an absolutely massive complex of buildings. You can clearly tell it used to be a car barn for streetcars. Now it's condominiums. Imagine living here.
This building was built in 1896 by the Metropolitan Railroad. After the streetcars disappeared in 1962, it was briefly used as a bus garage before being empty for over 3 decades. Finally, in 2004, this structure, which takes up a whole city block, was converted into condominiums. But let's get back to the history. We will find more artifacts along the way as we continue to tell this story. These 3 car barns remind us that in the second half of the 19th century, streetcars became massively popular, becoming the dominant mode of transportation in cities around the country, and no less so here in the nation's capital. But this rise of streetcars had to be temporary, right? Once the trolleys appeared on the scene, there were other companies that tried their luck at competing with the trolleys. They would run stagecoaches with plush, comfortable seating. Now, none of these companies were very successful or lasted very long because the streetcars just had these clear advantages. They could go faster, the horses could pull more people, and of course, the ride was more comfortable. At the end of the day, horse-drawn streetcars were more successful than horse-drawn wagons, but the streetcars themselves were facing a pressing equestrian problem of their own. See, horses just aren't the ideal way to power your trains, because, they poop. Well, that's not the only reason, though the waste of course was annoying, but horses also get tired easily, they need a lot of food, they can only pull so much, especially uphill, so you can only use them a few hours a day. They can get injured, and because of how labor intensive it is to pull a loaded streetcar, they tended not to live very long and were in need of constant replacement. So it wasn't long before the streetcar companies began asking Congress for permission to switch to an alternative power source. But to what? That remained to be seen. All sorts of experiments were done. With steam, compressed air, batteries, none made it very far. But in 1890, 2 companies, the Washington and Georgetown and the Columbia, installed underground cables so they could run cable cars. That's right, the technology that had been pioneered in San Francisco also found a home in Washington, albeit for a very short period of time. Cable cars are unpowered, but a grip attached to the train goes through a groove in the street and grabs onto a perpetually moving cable, allowing the car to move forward. The cables were spun at a central location. Now I'm standing in the Federal Triangle, and behind me is the Wilson Building. The Wilson Building was built in 1908 by the federal government, and it housed the 3 presidentially appointed officials who basically governed the District of Columbia. Now, thankfully, in 1973, the DC Home Rule Act was passed, and since then, this building houses the offices for the mayor, the city administrator, the DC City Council, offices like that. Now, why is any of that relevant to this video? Because where the Wilson Building stands today, that was where all of the Washington and Georgetown's cables were spun. That is, until 1897, when a devastating fire completely destroyed the facility. The building was a total loss, and eventually the railway just sold the land to the federal government, who built the building we see today. That fire also completely annihilated the railway's ability to run cable cars, so they had to quickly scramble together enough horses to provide service again. So then they began installing a different power source, one that the other companies had already begun to use: electricity. The first electric streetcar ran in Richmond, Virginia, not far away, in 1888. Seeing the advantages, DC companies were eager to adopt this. The easiest, most common way to electrically power your streetcars is to hang up an overhead wire. Trolleys pick up the current using a trolley pole. So the original companies all converted to electric power, but there were also a bunch of new companies that were founded that built electric lines. The first electric streetcar in DC was actually the Eckington and Soldiers Home Railway, which opened in 1888. Mind you, that's 2 years before the first cable cars. It ran from the White House to where Catholic University is now, and when I was retracing the old route through the Eckington neighborhood, I came across this, embedded in the streets.
All right, you guys, I've been walking up 3rd Street Northeast, and I think, I'm not fully sure, but I think that I've actually found some old rails. So it's not metal, but judging by the size, I think this has to be where there used to be a rail.
I'm not 100% sure that they are rails, but I asked my friends at the Trolley Museum and they thought it was. And even if it's not rails, this is the street that they ran through. So it's definitely interesting to look at. But after walking a little bit more, I ended up at the Eckington Car Barn. This one was built in the 1920s after the original burned down. Freaking fires. Today it is used by the United States Postal Service to maintain their vehicles. Not streetcars, but it's pretty cool that they still use it for something transportation related. Another electric streetcar company that was founded was the Rock Creek Railway, which opened in 1890, running from Shaw up to Chevy Chase. The Capitol Trolley Museum has an amazing miniature model of the Rock Creek Railway.
You said this was your most popular?
It's the most popular exhibit because this was all custom built for us. The models, they're not powered by the rail, they're actually powered by the overhead line.
Oh, cool.
If you walk down Connecticut Avenue, the real one, not the small one, in the Woodley Park neighborhood just north of the zoo, you will find a bridge over the Klingel Valley Trail. The bridge has these light posts, which might seem like normal light posts, but they're much taller than the lights. That's because these posts used to carry trolley wires, another relic of the streetcar system that you might never notice unless you knew what you were looking for. But there was one problem. Congress. Or rather, Congress's response to voices in the newspapers that were saying the electric wires would ruin the pristine views of the buildings and monuments. This was only a few years before Union Station would be built for very similar reasons, to preserve the Capitol's aesthetics. But anyway, Congress passed a law that said there would be no overhead wires in the original city of Washington. At the same time, they also legally required the streetcars to step away from horses by 1893. So the streetcars went electric, but without overhead wires, what did they use instead? Let's go back to Georgetown and check it out.
Here, on some short sections of O and P streets, you can still see the streetcar tracks embedded in the cobblestone streets. Now, they haven't been left here by accident. It's very much deliberate. In fact, the people in these neighborhoods have fought tooth and nail not to get rid of the tracks, but to keep them.
They did this to preserve history, but also because it was slowing down drivers and making the streets safer.
When you look at the tracks in Georgetown, you'll notice that there's a groove in the middle of the tracks. No, under the tracks here, there was an electric conduit, and the trolleys, they had a foot attached to them that would go through this groove and make contact with the electricity. And that's eventually how most of the streetcars in DC were powered.
The Trolley Museum actually has a section preserved, where you can see a cross-section and what it looks like underground.
It's buried about 3 feet underground. The system was only used where absolutely necessary. It was only required in the city of Washington proper, which is different than the borders of the District of Columbia. Reason being is that Congress wanted to preserve the look and feel of this colonial downtown. So in order to have electric streetcar service, they had to bury that electric current underground. Washington was not the only city that used this. It was also used on the island of Manhattan and in London. But again, because the system was so expensive to build and maintain, because you had to dig up more street to put in the track rather, they stopped it basically as soon as it got to the border of the city of Washington. So you would have something called a plow pit. Basically, there would be a guy underground who would take the shoe on or off, somebody on the street level to put the pole on or off, so that way people could get a one-seat ride from their home in the suburbs into their place of work in the city and back in the evening.
Installing this type of underground conduit was way more expensive than an overhead wire, but the law is the law and the companies complied.
Of course, the system was not exactly flawless. This groove, ice would come in it in the winter, and in the summer, when it's 103 degrees like it is today, the metal would kind of swell and it would make it really hard for the trolley foot to go through it.
And in the winter, the city could not use salt to de-ice because it would corrode the metal. Not only was the installation of these conduits expensive, so was the maintenance. Which is why whenever they could, the companies would use overhead wires. Electricity wasn't a public utility back then, so the streetcar companies generated their own power, and they sold this electricity to people living along the lines, improving their standard of living. If you live in DC, you might have gotten a bill from Pepco in the mail. Yeah, they were founded in 1891 to power the streetcars in Georgetown. and we can find remnants of the electric history of streetcars in many different places.
If you really pay attention to small details while you walk, you'll notice remnants of the streetcar network in the most mundane things, like manhole covers. Manhole covers may seem like the most boring, normal thing you could ever think of. Why would you even look at them? This one on 11th Street and C Street in Northeast DC, this one is worth taking a look at.
Streetcar employees would access the underground electrical installations through these manholes, and I think it's absolutely wild that this manhole cover still exists. The Anacostia and Potomac River Railroad went electric in 1900, and by the 1930s, the name was no longer in use, following a series of mergers. So this manhole cover has to be from somewhere between then.
So I know I said I would talk about the snow remover, so let's do that right now. Of course, in any system, getting snow off the tracks is important, but with the conduit system, it was especially important. You don't want snow getting in there and then freezing. So the streetcars ran snow removers like this one. This one was built in 1898 and was in service all the way until the end of streetcars in 1962. And these giant bamboo bristles underneath would just push the snow out of the way. The Capitol Trolley Museum has one of these, and just like the other 19th century car in the museum's collection, it is still in working condition. In fact, here it is doing what it was made for on the tracks of the Trolley Museum. The 1890s and early 1900s were not only a time of enormous streetcar expansion, but also of what they called the Great Streetcar Consolidation. Basically, over 2 decades, all of the different private companies operating electric trolleys merged to form 2 main rivals, Capital Traction and the Washington Railway and Electric Company, or WREC for short. These were the golden days in terms of ridership and expansion. You could take a trolley pretty much everywhere in the district, and outside of it too. Now, let's go take a look at some more car barns. There's one neighborhood in DC that has a higher concentration of these than any other neighborhood. I'm in Georgetown again, just a few blocks south of where you can still see the rails embedded in the street. Now, if you've been to Georgetown, you might think of upscale stores, big mansions, terrible traffic, but here in Georgetown, there are not 1, not 2, but 3 buildings that directly date back to the streetcar era. And I'm standing in front of one right now. These are the shops at Georgetown. In the basement, there's the DMV where I got my DC driver's license when I first moved here. That used to be a car barn. They used to keep streetcars there.
This one of 2 car barns on M Street, is actually older than the streetcars. It opened in 1838 as a tobacco warehouse. It was later sold and converted to house horse-drawn buses, then horse-drawn streetcars, and finally electric trolleys. After the streetcars closed, it served a short stint as a Department of Defense building and was then converted to a shopping mall in the 1970s, with new buildings added to the old ones. Next time you're at H&M or TJ Maxx, you'll have that fun fact ready to impress your fellow shoppers with. Or not.
And then once you've checked that out, all you have to do is cross the canal, walk a block, and you'll be at the Gray Street Powerhouse.
The Gray Street Powerhouse is another example of a building that had a different function before the streetcars. It is located literally behind the barn we just looked at, so it's easy to combine visiting the two. The name Powerhouse might make you think it generated electricity for the trolleys, but actually it opened in 1917 as a power plant for a paper company. But just 2 years later, the paper company sold it to the Capital Traction Company, who used it as extra storage space for cars. Today, the headquarters of a news agency known as News of the US are located here. Notice is a nonprofit news agency that gives young journalists the opportunity to begin their careers as reporters.
It's funny, I have multiple friends who are journalists at that organization. I walk past this building all the time, and I actually had no idea.
So I actually reached out to my friends for a tour, and we were totally going to do it, but with the election and then the holidays, unfortunately, we couldn't find a time that worked. Now, the main attraction here in Georgetown is a few blocks to the west on M Street. It's a building that, unlike the other two, was explicitly built for the streetcars. Let me introduce you to the Georgetown Car Barn. This towering brick building stands at the base of a hill, looking across the Potomac River. Today, this landmark is owned by Georgetown University, housing a graduate department. But it began its life in 1897 as a Union Station of sorts, a building where multiple railways could come together. It opened during the cable car days. On the bottom floor, passengers could get on streetcars of the Capital Traction Company, who built the building. Inside, there were beautiful waiting rooms for passengers and office spaces for employees of the streetcar companies. And of course it was a car barn, so vehicles were maintained here. Upstairs, passengers could get on trolleys of the Metropolitan Railway, which is why I said that it's a Union Station, a term that in the United States means a station shared by multiple companies. In 1911, it was extensively renovated, including the installation of a streetcar elevator. But in 1949, the last passengers hopped on a streetcar here. And after that, for a year, they continued to store cars here, but by 1950, they no longer did that either. Having lost its streetcar function, for a while, the building served as a police academy for the CIA. It was then passed down to several different owners over the years, now being the property of Georgetown University.
The gas station sits empty and abandoned, but the car barn lives on.
And if you're a fan of horror movies, you may recognize these steps from a famous 1973 film.
So the car barn was built into a hill, and it was multiple stories, so they had to remove a lot of land, and it became a cliff. Now, in order for people to be able to get up the cliff, they had to build these steps.
So every single time I come here, I always see multiple people taking pictures of these steps. Why?
These steps were featured in a horror movie known as The Exorcist.
Car barns are cool and all, but say you want to visit an old streetcar site, but you've got your kids with you. They don't want to look at an old building. Well, why not take them to a park? This is 11th and Monroe Park, also known as Trolley Park, located between Columbia Heights and Petworth. You'll recognize it by the giant fare token mounted on the gate. This park is a former streetcar turnaround that has been converted into a playground. What's a turnaround? Well, electric streetcars only had a driver's seat and controls on one end. So when a trolley reached the end of its route, it had to use a loop of track to turn around. Here at the playground, you can still see the shape of the rails in the bricks on the ground, clearly forming a loop shape. There are still quite a few loops preserved around the city, albeit without tracks. In the Mount Pleasant neighborhood, not far away, we find Lamont Park. The round shape of the sidewalk should provide a clue as to what this used to be. And then the many signs with historical information confirm that yes, Lamont Park was built on the site of another streetcar loop. And now it's kind of a bus loop. Metrobus routes 42 and 43 terminate here, driving around the park to change directions and head back towards Foggy Bottom. Actually, buses using old streetcar loops is a relatively common phenomenon in many cities, and Washington, D.C. is no exception.
But this is the streetcar/bus loop at 14th Street and Colorado Avenue. And what makes this so cool is not only that it is still used as a bus loop, but that you can actually still see the old streetcar station.
The 14th Street line was one of the lines that had briefly been served by cable cars before making the switch over to electric power. The loop at Colorado Avenue has been in service since at least the 1920s, maybe earlier. The station building was built in the 1940s. Once a busy streetcar terminus, today it serves as a turnaround for some buses on routes 52 and 54, which are still some of the most used bus routes in the city. The building is used by bus drivers on their break. The red brick, black entryway, and round windows give it a very classic look. Some buildings we've seen so far are a little bit more subtle. You might not know that they were old streetcar structures, but this is clearly a station. I mean, how cool is this? You can still visit old streetcar stations right here in Washington, D.C., and this isn't the only one either. Immediately to the east of the Calvert Street Bridge over Rock Creek, you'll find another turnaround, the last one we'll look at today. You know you've spotted it when you see the mural of Mama Aisha with all the presidents. This loop, which is used by bus routes 90 and 92 today, supposedly still has old streetcar rails embedded underneath the asphalt, according to some sources. I had no independent way to verify this. I left my pickaxe at home. Anyway, it's another example of old streetcar infrastructure still being used by buses, although the building in the middle wasn't originally used for transit purposes. This little white hut used to be a diner. It was called the Tuttle House Diner, and it closed in 1971, outliving the streetcars. And now it just houses toilets for bus drivers. We've seen old streetcar stuff reused in many different creative ways throughout this video, but I do always appreciate when these things still serve a transit-related purpose. Which leads me to the last car barn that I'll show you today, located just a few blocks south of the Colorado Avenue loop that we looked at previously. Now behind me is another car barn, and all the car barns that we have seen up until now had been repurposed into other things. This one is still being used as a bus garage. The Decatur Street Car Barn is still used as a... Wait, what? Where's the car barn? Did they tear it down? Yeah, sort of. The barn originally opened in 1906, it started servicing buses in 1926, and moved exclusively to house buses in 1959. It was the only car barn to still be used for transit in Washington, D.C. But in 2023, WMATA began to demolish it. Why? Well, here they are building a brand new bus garage which will serve electric buses. Thankfully, the facade of the original structure has been preserved and it will be incorporated into the new bus garage when it opens in 2027. So in my book, it still counts. Washington, D.C. is very small in terms of surface area, and the metropolitan area spreads out into the neighboring states of Maryland and Virginia. Today, the metro runs seamlessly between all three, but back in the streetcar days, you could also travel across state lines. In Maryland, there were multiple interurban railroads that connected D.C. with other cities throughout the state. Two examples are the Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis, and the Chesapeake Beach Railway. Both connected to the DC streetcar system at Seat Pleasant and then carried passengers in luxury and at high speed to their destinations. Little is left of the WB&A.
They had on the windows at the top of the car kind of a stained glass look to them. Mm-hmm. And the only thing that's left of the WB&A, as far as we know, is this one piece of stained glass from one car. That is all that's left of it today.
This is so unfortunate. I love visiting Annapolis, but it's so hard to do with public transportation. As for the Chesapeake Beach Railway, some of their equipment has been preserved at the Chesapeake Beach Railway Museum, which is housed in the old Chesapeake Beach station, worth a visit. But many of the DC-based companies also expanded into Maryland. For example, if you've ever been to College Park, Maryland, you may have biked over the Rhode Island Avenue Trolley Trail. This uses the right-of-way of the City and Suburban Railway, which ran from downtown DC into Laurel, Maryland. The lines to Maryland served existing suburbs, but the owners of the companies also created their own destinations. In some cases, these were luxurious planned suburbs with spaced-out houses. Sometimes they were theme parks. So on weekdays, streetcar companies had no issues getting people to ride their streetcars because people got to go to work. But what about on the weekends? Well, you create destinations that people want to come to, like a theme park. Right now, I'm at Glen Echo Park, and this was developed by the streetcars to get people to ride them on Saturdays and Sundays. Actually, a very common phenomenon throughout the country, but what's unique is that Glen Echo Park is pretty much completely preserved. It's run by the National Park Service now, but you can still see the old buildings, the old attractions. There's an aquarium where you can go inside and learn about the animals that live in the Chesapeake Bay. I will say I walked into the aquarium and I was like, hello, is anybody home? But yes, there were 3 volunteers and they had so much to tell me about all the species. Apparently the exhibits are organized from freshwater to saltwater, and apparently they're all local species. Like, did you know that there were seahorses in the Chesapeake Bay? I didn't.
And when you stand by the entrance, you will see the tracks embedded in the street. The trolley stopped right in front of the park. So you could just take the trolley to Glen Echo Park, have a great day with your family, and then take it back. Over here, kind of as a barrier to the road, we still have rails. Wonder how old those are. And to get to Glen Echo Park was probably a faster trip than most, because the name streetcar suggests that they run in the middle of the street. The route to Glen Echo actually had its own right-of-way for most of the way. It kind of cut through forests, and most of that right-of-way is gone, but there is some in Georgetown that has been preserved. Okay, for this next site, we have to do a little bit of hiking through the woods, but it'll be worth it because I'm about to show you the trestle bridge that is just to the west of Georgetown's campus.
So yes, trolleys would leave Georgetown, travel over this trestle and then several more to eventually cross the border into Maryland, reach at Glen Echo, and then Cabin John. And trestles like this allowed it to take the fastest route over there, so it was a speedy way to get to the amusement park and the suburbs. Now, fun fact, it's actually WMATA, DC's metro operator, who owns this bridge. They received it in 1997 as part of a settlement that had to do with some financial crimes of the last streetcar company. WMATA doesn't want it because it is in really terrible state. It's crumbling. They've actually blocked off the part underneath, so you can't hike underneath it because stuff might fall on your head. But because of its historic nature, there are a lot of voices opposed to demolishing it. Some people have even suggested converting it into a walking trail. So if you want to go see this, I would encourage you to do it soon because the owners actively want it gone. Now, what about Virginia? Well, the land across the river also had an expansive streetcar network. The history of these networks is just as interesting and perhaps worth its own video someday. And there are a few remnants scattered around the region, but to find those would make this video even longer. So today, I want to discuss how they interacted with Washington, D.C. One company, the Washington Virginia Railway, operated a group of lines from D.C. into Arlington, Alexandria, and Fairfax, serving a variety of commuter destinations, but also catering to leisure travel, with stops at Arlington Cemetery, Mount Vernon, and Luna Park. Luna Park was another amusement park owned by a streetcar company. It no longer exists. Today there is a bus garage and a sewage treatment plant on the site of the old theme park. These trolleys terminated in downtown DC and crossed the river over the Long Bridge, sharing the tracks with mainline long-distance trains. Later, the trolleys shifted over to the highway bridge next to the railroad bridge. The other main trolley company was the Washington and Old Dominion, a railway that did not originally start out as an electric streetcar operator, but just as a regular railway. The history of the W&OD is a little complicated, and this line will definitely get its own video someday, but basically, these interurbans connected Georgetown to Great Falls or the Blue Ridge Mountains, via Roslyn, Vienna, Leesburg, and Purcellville. I took a bus out to Purcellville recently, and to see that video, make sure you subscribe to Trains Are Awesome. But the relationship between the W&OD and the DC streetcars was not great.
So behind me you see the Francis Scott Key Bridge, named after Francis Scott Key, the guy who wrote the national anthem, who had a house right where the bridge stands. This isn't the original bridge. There used to be a bridge known as the Aqueduct Bridge, which took trains of the Washington and Old Dominion Railroad into the Georgetown Car Barn. However, in 1923, the bridge was replaced. The current Key Bridge was built, and the Key Bridge had tracks on it too, but because of politics and such, the W&OD was no longer allowed to run their trains into DC. Instead, the DC streetcars ran across the river into Roslyn, and that's where the interchange station was located between the DC system and the Virginia system.
The trolleys in Virginia did not last as long as they did in DC. The fact that the end was coming became pretty obvious by the 1930s. This was due to general trends, like the introduction of the automobile, but also due to specific local reasons, like the fact that the federal government was building things on the land previously used by streetcars. Eventually, the W&OD stopped electric operations in the 1940s. The line was converted to a diesel freight line until 1968, when it was closed altogether and ripped up. The Washington, Virginia Railway, which had been renamed to Arlington and Fairfax, had stopped running across the river in 1932. In light of declining ridership, they decided to experiment with auto-railers, a bus-tram hybrid that had steel wheels and rubber tires. It could run on tracks and on the road. The Trolley Museum recently acquired one of these auto-railers, and they're hoping to restore it over the next several years. However, not even the auto-railer could save the company, and in 1939, the last one was taken out of service. Streetcar service in DC lasted longer, but that doesn't mean that they weren't under threat either. The first gas-powered taxis entered the scene in 1908, followed by buses in 1915. A company known as Washington Rapid Transit began operating buses, and they only captured a small percentage of riders. The streetcars collectively had over 200 miles of track, but nevertheless, competition was growing. Finally, in 1933, the last merger occurred. The new Capital Transit Company was formed when the WREC, Capital Traction, and Washington Rapid Transit were all absorbed into it. Capital Transit continued to face declining ridership, now fueled by the growing popularity of personal automobiles. They addressed this by closing certain lines. The Great Depression and World War II brought a little bit of relief to Capital Transit. People could not afford the high price of fuel, and wartime rationing similarly limited people's availability to drive. It gave Capital Transit and agencies around the country time to come together and strategize about the future. And so the President's Conference Committee car was born. Presidents from different transit companies came together and designed a modern, comfortable trolley that was meant to make the streetcar attractive for years to come. Besides comfortable upholstery and classy mood lighting, these cars had small windows that allowed passengers to look outside without bending over. They were also designed so that a trolley only needed a driver, no separate conductor, allowing companies to save significantly on labor costs. PCCs were massively popular around the country and even around the world. Cities like Toronto, The Hague, and Antwerp use them, and places like San Francisco, Philadelphia, or Kenosha, Wisconsin still use them to this very day. But DC was an eager customer. They ran some early prototypes of the PCC. One of these was in the Trolley Museum's collection, but was unfortunately destroyed in a fire years ago.
They wanted to test a lot of the features that they were going to do in the PCC. Both Brill and the St. Louis Car Company built these pre-PCC cars. They built 10 each to kind of test different features and see which one would have the better design.
Capital Transit also ordered many full production PCCs, eventually having 489 in their fleet. Washington, D.C. was the first city in the world to exclusively run PCCs. Capital Transit also introduced route numbers for the first time, something that seems so normal to us today. For example, trolleys running down Pennsylvania Avenue got numbered in the 30s, streetcars going up 14th Street were numbered in the 50s. Remember this for later. The trolleys wore this turquoise livery, which was fairly unique for transit companies. In 1955, a businessman named O'Roy Chalk bought the Capital Traction Company and renamed it DC Transit. He added the orange details to the livery of the PCCs. Why?
The orange specifically was his wife's favorite color, so he incorporated that in all of his properties.
Washington, D.C. began thinking about its first subways. Now, I'm not talking about the metro like we know it now, but the existing streetcar system was dug underground in a number of places, out of sight and out of the way. The first place was right here in front of the Capitol. The C Street Tunnel opened so that the streetcars would no longer obstruct the view of the Capitol. They just wanted to build this park over here and the fountain So the streetcars went under the ground.
Okay, to say it was just dug for aesthetic reasons wouldn't exactly be fair either. The C Street Tunnel opened in 1931, and it did allow for streetcars to go from Union Station to the Capitol and beyond quicker, since they didn't have to make a bunch of turns in that area anymore. And the park up here is really nice, albeit a very quiet park.
The tunnel is no longer used by streetcars, of course, but today it serves as a parking garage.
And you can visit the remainder of the C Street Tunnel by going to Senate Park, which is located in between Union Station and the Capitol. This wasn't the only tunnel that was dug. There were 2 more streetcar tunnels, both which were created in the 1940s to get out of the way of vehicle traffic.
I'm crossing 14th Street right now. This is a pretty touristy area. We got the mall on one side, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing on the other, and it just looks like a street right now. But underneath here, there used to be a large trolley station.
An underground loop and station were built underneath 14th Street. And while some of the tracks allegedly still exist today in the concrete of the parking lot of the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, that's not a publicly accessible area. However, when walking in this neighborhood, you will still see many of the entrances to the old station that have been sealed off, but are otherwise in pretty good shape.
So I just got done with a tour of the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. It was super interesting. Obviously can't film in there, but it was so cool to see the money being printed and stacked and everything. And I asked my tour guide a question because I had read online that in one of the parking lots, it's kind of built where the old streetcar station used to be, and there are still remnants of the rails in there. So I asked her if she knew about that, if she'd ever seen them. She said that was the first time she had ever heard of that. So are they there? It's a mystery.
Not to worry, for there is one more abandoned underground station in Washington, D.C., except this one isn't really abandoned.
So this is Dupont Circle, and like many of DC's infamous traffic circles, it can be a pain to drive around. Traffic's not too bad right now, but I have been on buses that just take forever to make it through even just a quarter of the circle, what with all the lights and all the streets you can turn off.
As a pedestrian, crossing Dupont Circle isn't always a very pleasant experience either, although once you're in the middle, there is a nice little green area.
So of course, having a nice quiet park in the middle of the city like this is great, but if you're a streetcar, getting stuck in the congestion is something you'll want to avoid. Well, there's no bridge up here, so you can't go over it. Looks like you'll have to go under it.
So in 1949, 2 tunnels were dug, bringing Connecticut Avenue underneath Dupont Circle. One is still in use today by some buses, but the other was exclusively for streetcars. And when you look around the circle, you will still find these sealed up entrances to the Dupont Circle underground streetcar station everywhere. Both the streetcar tunnel and the road tunnel were built in 1949 because Dupont Circle had some of the worst traffic congestion in the entire city. And streetcars were partially to blame for that. Dupont Circle, of course, is one of DC's crazy super roundabouts, but at least traffic does all go in the same direction, except for the streetcars. The northbound streetcars went clockwise, and so the risk of accidents and just backups was very high. So they dug them underground. The road follows a straight line, but the streetcar tunnels followed the shape of the circle. Since the ramps down into the tunnel were paved, there were many drivers that accidentally went down the streetcar tunnel, which of course led to very dangerous situations. Now, of course, the streetcars are gone, but if you come here on a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, you can visit Dupont Underground. That's right. One of these entrances is open. You can walk down the stairs and you will find yourself in a free art exhibit that has completely repurposed the space once used by the streetcars.
Right now I'm in a place called Dupont Underground. It's like an artist collective. It's a free art exhibit open on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. You walk down the steps of the old entrance and you're in the station. Now the art in here is really cool. Right now there's an exhibit on Italian art. It's worth checking out just for that. But I mean, the station is intact. Like, there are street signs above the entrances and the rails are there, the conduits are there. It's all here. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to just picture a PCC running through here. Man, I wish they still did.
Of course, they didn't know it yet, But 1962 was only 13 years away, and so this tunnel never saw streetcar service for very long. After the streetcars left, it was an exclusive bus tunnel, but a lot of the buses had trouble making the tight turns, and so eventually the entrance was just sealed off completely. But because it was the Cold War, the city began putting supplies in the tunnel in case of a bombing. DC was never bombed, of course, and some of the supplies were later unearthed and sent to Bangladesh during a 1974 famine. Throughout the years, there were many ideas for what to do with the space, a shopping mall, a food court, but none of those ever really got off the ground, or under the ground, I don't know, until 2016 when Dupont Underground opened, and now it's an art and event space.
You do have to duck your head a little bit to get in there, but there is a wheelchair lift as well. One of my favorite stops so far in this video. Really, really cool spot in Washington, DC. And now for some Christmas shopping. Also, fun but completely unrelated fact, this house behind me is the most expensive house in the District of Columbia. It's worth an estimated $29 million. A little bit out of my budget, but go to my Patreon, I guess.
Unfortunately, the end of the streetcar was approaching full throttle. There's no one answer as to why the streetcar was declining in Washington, D.C. It wasn't just the rise of the automobile, although the fact that ownership doubled between the 1930s and 1950s definitely contributed. It wasn't just the government. There were a lot of factors that went into it. Capital Transit was owned by a man named Lewis Wolfson, and Wolfson was not good with money. Well, he was good at making himself money, but staff, maintenance, not so much. And it was definitely difficult to maintain the DC streetcar network, mostly because of the underground conduits. Now, eventually, the staff at Capital Transit wanted a raise. Wolfson wanted to raise the fares, but that got blocked by the government, and so the staff didn't get a raise. They went on a number of strikes, which ultimately led to terrible traffic and Capital Transit being sold from Wolfson to Mr. O'Roy Chalk. Remember him? Now, when that transaction happened in 1956, Congress told O'Roy Chalk that he had to phase out streetcars by 1963. Can you believe that? Buses and cars were just considered more modern, and Congress wanted the streetcars out of the city. Although he was personally a fan of the streetcars, O'Roy Chalk complied, and at 2 a.m., January 28, 1962, 100 years after the first streetcar ran, the very last streetcar rolled into Navy Yard.
So in 1962, the century of streetcars in Washington, D.C. came to a close. For the next decade and a half or so, if you didn't drive, your only option was the bus, until the metro opened in the 1970s and a new era of transportation in Washington, D.C. began. Now, we've spent the entire video looking at remnants of the old streetcar system, but there's one more remnant that needs to be mentioned. It's one that lives on, at least for now.
And that is the bus network, specifically the way the buses in DC are numbered. So WMATA has several different numbering systems, but in Washington, D.C., any bus route that is just a number, no letters attached, directly descends from one of these streetcar routes. So like I said, streetcars on Pennsylvania Avenue were numbered in the 30s. Well, the 31, 33, 32, and 36 still run down Pennsylvania Avenue. And the same applies for buses numbered in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. It's a cool nod to history, but it is going away very soon. This summer, WMATA is implementing the Better Bus Network, the first bus redesign since they took over operations from DC Transit in the 1970s. And what's going to happen is all the buses are going to get a new route number. Buses in Washington, DC are going to be D followed by a number or C followed by a number, but anyways, the numbering system that points back to the streetcar era will be gone, which is unfortunate even if the bus redesign is very necessary. Anyway, before the bus redesign happens, I am hoping to go out and about and ride some of the most interesting buses that are slated to disappear when Better Bus is introduced, so if you'd like to see that, subscribe to Trains Are Awesome.
Hey everyone, it's Tom here with Louie on the last day of editing for this video. I just wanted to kind of share what went into this. So I had the idea for this video, I think in spring of 2024, but I was still working on my
railroads video of Washington, D.C. I wanted to get that finished first. So once I finished that in the summer, I started filming for this video. So the footage is from summer 2024 all the way up until yesterday when I finally visited Glen Echo Park. This quickly turned into the biggest video that I've ever made on the channel. I wasn't expecting that, but we traveled all across the city over 6 months, and I'm really grateful for that. Really grateful to get to know my city a little bit better in this way, not just the history, but all the different neighborhoods. Of course, this was a passion project, but it took a lot of effort, much more than I normally put into a video. So if you enjoyed this, if you learned something new, if you just liked seeing Louis at the end, please consider subscribing to this channel. I'm really looking forward to everything else 2025 is going to bring, and I would just love to have you be a part of that. Thank you so much for watching today. We'll see you next time.